This lecture will address American politics from 1969 to 1981 and will highlight the presidential administrations of both Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter. We'll begin with an exploration of Nixon's background and then investigate some of his policy successes in both domestic and foreign affairs. However, a discussion of his administration must also include the Watergate scandal. Some of the highlights of Carter's presidency will also be covered. There are two questions you might want to consider as you follow this lecture. First, was the legacy of Richard Nixon's presidency positive or negative for the nation? Secondly, by 1980, some described the United States as a second-rate world power. Do you agree or disagree with this argument? Richard Nixon brought a unique background to the White House and years of experience in politics. Nixon was one of the most well-known politicians in the United States as early as the 1950s. This was primarily because he had served as vice president under the popular Dwight Eisenhower. His reputation was that of a conservative Republican. Some thought his political career had ended when he lost the presidential election of 1960 to John Kennedy. However, he just stepped into the background for a short time. In many ways, Nixon was most known for his strong anti-communist views. These were shown in his actions as vice president, but also prior to that when he was a member of Congress. We'll see how these views impacted his presidency in a short time. The so-called kitchen debate was part of the symbolic anti-communism associated with Richard Nixon. Here we see Vice President Nixon meeting with the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, in 1959 at the American exhibit in Moscow. Nixon defended the quality of American washing machines and television sets to an international audience. Nixon had a wide range of goals and had to address different concerns when it came to domestic affairs. One area deals with the environment. Deeper interest in the environment was sparked by the publication of Silent Spring in 1962. This was written by a former researcher for the Fish and Wildlife Service named Rachel Carson. In her book, Carson outlined the dangers of pesticide use and how chemicals such as DDT impacted plant and animal life as well as human beings. The growing interest in environmental issues is probably best seen when 20 million Americans celebrated the first Earth Day in 1970. While Nixon didn't agree with all the suggestions of environmentalists during his presidency, we do see several pieces of environmental legislation put into place. Among others, higher water quality standards were established to protect drinking water, as well as additional regulations to protect marine life and coastlines. The auto industry also faced new regulations when a ceiling was placed on the levels of pollutant emissions cars were allowed to put into the air. Finally, the Environmental Protection Agency was created by Congress in 1971 to oversee the new regulations and restrictions mandated by Congress. The Vietnam War, followed by spending on the Great Society, took its toll on the U.S. economy, as seen with this chart outlining rising rates of inflation. Nixon responded by cutting spending and raising interest rates. The result was the first recession since Eisenhower was president. Next, he tried deficit spending to stimulate the economy. This resulted in huge budget deficits. He also tried establishing wage and price controls, which helped for a short time, but in the long run, inflation continued and deficits increased. With another Republican in the White House, some wondered if Nixon would try to dismantle the Great Society programs associated with Lyndon Johnson. Nixon surprised many with his support for what came to be known as the Family Assistance Program. The Family Assistance Plan was Nixon's program to overhaul Johnson's Great Society and end welfare as they knew it in 1970. It actually wasn't as conservative as many thought, because it would guarantee a family of four an income of at least $1,600 per year. This was significant because $1,600 per year was more than most state welfare agencies were paying at the time. At the same time, heads of households who received these monies were required to enroll in job training. Essentially, this was designed to provide short-term assistance with money, with a long-term goal of getting people off of welfare with the required job training. While it failed to pass Congress, it demonstrated Nixon's centrist rather than conservative approach to domestic politics. Nixon also had to address many issues associated with foreign policy. Probably Nixon's greatest successes came in foreign policy when he ushered in a new relationship between the United States and communist nations. The new policy was called détente. In this context, détente meant closer and more positive relations between the United States and communist nations. We'll see examples of détente with both China and the Soviet Union. Nixon's chief deputy who helped him carry out these policies was a former refugee from Hitler's Germany who was also a well-respected professor of international relations. This deputy was Henry Kissinger. Over the next several years, Kissinger would hold a variety of positions within the Nixon White House. Détente was first seen with China. Since 1949, the United States had not recognized the communist government in China. Relations were so bad that Chinese Americans who were born in China were prohibited from traveling from the United States to China to visit relatives. Under Nixon, the United States began the process to normalize relations or to recognize China's communist government. In a major symbolic gesture demonstrating the shift in policy, in February of 1972, Nixon traveled to China where, among other things, he met with Chinese leaders and visited the Great Wall. Détente was also seen with the Soviet Union. This first began with a visit by Nixon to Russia in the summer of 1972. Two additional agreements also demonstrate the tangible results of détente. First, the United States sold 400 million tons of grain to the Soviets at below market prices. This made the Soviets happy, but it also made American farmers happy as Nixon found a new market for their goods. We also see SALT, which stood for the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. For the first time, the Americans and Soviets agreed to place limits on the numbers of offensive nuclear weapons for each nation. On the left, we see a definition of détente, which was provided earlier. Now is a good time to offer some analysis. Overall, this was a tremendous accomplishment for Nixon, possibly one of the greatest of his administration. The key strength of both Nixon and Kissinger was that they recognized the split between Chinese and Russian communists. They used this divide to play the two powers off against one another. Who else could have accomplished this? Possibly no one other than Richard Nixon himself. Others would have been labeled as soft on communism. Instead, Nixon used his impeccable anti-communist credentials to adopt a new policy toward communist nations as he demonstrated an ability to act as a true statesman.